picked just the right spot, so that's fine. Yeah. Close enough? Okay. Friends, welcome to First Congregational United Church of Christ. My name is Sue Joyner. I'm the senior minister here, and I am so thrilled that you've chosen to spend your next hour, hour and a half with us. I can't think of a better thing you can do. And then to top it off, if you want, you can go hit the Twinkle Light Parade afterwards. So it's kind of a banner night here in Albuquerque. I want to just do a couple housekeeping things. There are what do you call these? Index cards at the end of your pews, and it's a chance for you to write questions. Charles is very open. He really loves the interaction, so he'll speak, but then there's plenty of time for you to add your own questions, and so you can be working on those throughout, and we'll have some runners who will bring those up to the front, and Michaela will kind of field those back and forth to Charles. We also want to welcome folks who are joining us online via Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. We are delighted to have folks who are with us online. And your questions also, you can put them in the chat, and we think we have a method to get those up to the front as well, so please do add your questions. Another thing is, almost a year ago, Michaela and Charles wrote an article for Sojourners magazine called The Measure of a Man, and I highly recommend. We have a few copies left up here, so we will share them with you if you'd like to come up and grab one at the end. So, and should I say something about, are you going to say something about the money? We didn't talk about that. We are trying to cover Charles's expenses here. There's a GoFundMe, so you'll watch as the slides go up. There's a GoFundMe that you can do. You could also write checks to Charles directly if you'd like. There's a basket in the back. I wanted to say a word about why this is important to me. This just was an opportunity that came our way last year, and I said yes without knowing much. And I've not often had this experience, but as Charles was speaking, and finishing up, I had this just visceral wanting to reach out and say, no, Charles, don't go, don't stop. I want more, please don't go. And so it took about 5 minutes to reach out to Michaela and say, how soon can we get him back? So we've spent the last year trying to do that. COVID stopped us a few times. There are many, many things to say about Charles. You will hear him speak, and that's the best thing, not what I say. But I've really encountered him as a spiritual teacher. He probably would be embarrassed to know that. But Charles, you make me want to be a better version of myself. And when I think about what I want to be in the world, I want to make room for more stories and more people in my circle. And Charles, you teach me how to do that. And so I'm deeply, deeply grateful that you were willing to make the journey back. I'm deeply grateful you were willing to spend this time with us this evening. And we are so excited to hear anything you want to share with us. And yeah, thank you. Will you join me in welcoming Charles Rodgers?
Test. Thank you. She certainly added the pressure. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be back in New Mexico. I've been able to drive around on my own now. I don't use GPS. I get lost and I use the mountains to find my way. I'm growing accustomed to green chili. Yesterday I had green and red chili, and the red was better than the green, so, you know. Christmas, I'll get the lingo right. But it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you guys and to learn the culture here and to meet the people and to see how concerned you guys are about what's happening around you. I have to admit that there is an element here, a criminal element here that I identify with, and what I see is a lot of sick and hurting and broken people. And so I guess I'll kind of start with that. I was just looking up some statistics, and I don't know if you know, but in the United States of America, we incarcerate more people than anywhere else in the world. In fact, as of September 8th, we have roughly 2 million people incarcerated. And there is something to be said of that. But before I dive too deeply into that, I'll start by saying my name is Charles Rodgers, and I was born January 10th, 1982. Of course, to a mother and father who were born in the Deep South. And so coming from that type of environment, I guess my mom was looking for something different, and so she moved to Boston, Massachusetts long before I ever was aware of what life was. I think I may have been a toddler. And once she got to Boston, if you're familiar, I believe President Ronald Reagan, I'm sure a lot of you remember Ronald Reagan, was president then, and what was happening in America at the time was there was a war on drugs, and the epidemic of crack cocaine had hit. And that epidemic hit my home, and it hit it fiercely. Of course, at the time, I didn't know exactly what it was. I was born into, like all of us, we're born into circumstances in its life, and we go through it and we figure it out. But for me, my mom had 11 brothers and sisters. I have 6 uncles. All 6 have been incarcerated. I have 4 aunts and my mom, all 5 of which have been incarcerated as well. And so naturally, I guess, statistically, it was written that I too would also be incarcerated. And the way it happened was that my mom got addicted to crack cocaine. My father went away to prison for life. And my mom was 21 years old with 3 kids. And of course, I wound up in the foster care system. And in that system, I like to talk about something called developmental stages. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but in developmental stages, it says that in infancy, a child learns love through affection. And through that affection, it stimulates certain portions of the brain that develop these synaptic connections that teaches the child to associate touch with love. And when those stages are missed, then that child grows up not associate in touch with love. And so what you'll see, and what I've heard as I've traveled through different prisons, is that a lot of people who wind up in prison come from environments where they were abused and not loved, and so they grow up antisocial, not associating that affection or love, or touch with love, and so they create a world of their own. And what happened with me is, because I wasn't getting love in my home, early on, maybe around 10 to 12 years old, I started seeking love in other places. And so what I found was that there was a community of kids in the neighborhood project development that I grew up with that had the same issues. And so we bonded together. And then when there was no food at home, what do? We went out and we stole things. We broke into cars. We broke into houses. We did whatever we felt at the time we had to do to get food or to get money or just to have the basic necessities of life, things that, a lot of you guys probably couldn't even conceptualize. So by the time I was 13 years old, I was arrested for 4 counts of armed robbery. And there is where I got introduced to the juvenile detention centers. And in there, I learned, of course, more about crime and more about how not to get caught, more than I learned about how not to ever come back again. And so when I was released from the juvenile detention center, I was released to foster care. And the foster care system, I can honestly say this, I don't know if it's a matter of lack of funding or the intent of some of the foster parents weren't always the best, because it was a thing of monetary value. And the more kids they had, the more money they received from the government. And so of the 10 foster homes that I bounced through from the age of 10 to 16, I can say that maybe 1 or 2 were actually genuine, and the others were no different than the abusive home that I left from. And so it fueled anger and bitterness inside of me. And so crime for me was nothing. I didn't necessarily feel bad when I committed a crime. I felt like it was a necessary evil, and it fulfilled a desire. It fulfilled a need in me, a basic need, just to eat. And so with that mindset, I began to run away from the foster homes and live in the streets and live in those environments. And it was too painful to be home with my mom, watching her being abused by her alcoholic, drug-addicted boyfriend. And so all of this is relevant even today, because it's what I see right here in New Mexico. I've been to the New Mexico State Penitentiary. We, in fact, went yesterday speaking to the guys. We went to another prison. We went to the juvenile detention centers. And in truth, my story is not unique. Of the 2 million people that are incarcerated, I'm fairly certain that the majority of them have very, very similar stories. I think what's unique about what I have to say is being able to, I guess in some ways, bridge the gap between that element over there and this civilized society over here. But that came to be because when I was 17 years old, I committed another armed robbery in the state of Louisiana. And what I would do is, at the age of 15, I would get on the Greyhound bus from Boston, Massachusetts, and ride down to Louisiana, where my mom had moved. And I do that alone. And along the way, I encountered all sorts of madness and got exposed to things that a child should never have been exposed to long since. And I always say today that once you see certain things, you can never, ever unsee them. You just learn how to live with that. And so on one bus trip back down to Louisiana, I was feeling desperate, broken, lost. Let me switch to another subject really quick, education. So because I was in and out of juvenile detention centers and foster homes, my lifestyle was so inconsistent that I couldn't focus on school. When I went to school, I would sleep because I was just so mentally exhausted. Education was not a priority in my life, survival was. And so while you had the overachievers there, getting the A's and, coming to school because they were protected and safe, they could focus on that. But if every day you have to figure out, if you're going to go home and he's going to beat your mom, or if the police are going to come, or just the constant chaos, didn't allow me to focus on school. And also, something else important to point out about that environment is culturally, we are taught in many respects to underachieve. I was taught to underachieve in school because if I did too well, then my mom wouldn't get the Social Security check from the government that said that I was mildly mentally retarded. So I had to go and take these exams, and she would tell me to intentionally fail the exam so that she can get the check from the government in order to support her habit. And that was her reality. That was her world. My mom was born in 1961. If you guys can think back to that time, what was happening at that time, I think we just had recently come out of segregation. It was poverty-stricken. It was, for some, it was a great way of life. Some say, I wish I can go back to the old days. But for others, it was horror. And so for her, that's what it was, and that's what she passed on. That's what my uncles passed on. That's what my aunts passed on. And so me growing up in the early 90s, it was just a part of the culture. And so now we're shifting back to the education system. I was 17 years old, technically in the 8th grade. I attempted school but couldn't focus on it, and I'll never forget the day I walked out of school. I was actually assigned to school in Louisiana. I lied to them. I told them I was in the 11th grade. They believed me. They put me in. The records hadn't come yet. Got in the 11th grade classroom. Couldn't do any of the work. Couldn't do any of it. The math, reading assignments, anything. I was failing out. So the guidance counselor came to me and they were like, hey, why don't you just drop out? We have a program. You can do welding. You can do this, that, or the other. And for me, it felt like the ultimate rejection because it solidified my failures in life up until that point. And so I told him no, I was going to stay in school. And she said, well, you do realize that you'll be 24 when you graduate, or some ridiculous number like that. And I said, I don't care, I'm staying. A couple of days or so after, I'm in class and I'm sleeping again, and the teacher comes and she slams her hand on the desk. And she says, outside right now. I go outside and she puts her finger in my face and she said, you're going to be another statistic. And she was screaming at me. And I started to cry and I cursed at her and I ran out of the school and I never went back. I think that she was coming from a good place, but what she didn't realize was that the last thing I needed was more tough love. And so that pushed me out of the door. And not long after that, I committed an armed robbery. I was caught a couple of days later. Later went to trial and was sentenced to 35 years with no chance of parole. When I got to prison, I was so used to the system that I quickly adjusted to it. I knew what I had to do in there, from juvenile detention centers. And so when I got to prison, I was a 17-year-old kid in there with 40, 50-year-old men, and I had to fight, and I fought a lot. In fact, I fought so much that I counted. I had like 31 fights in prison, and it was honestly 50% my fault because I felt like I had something to prove, and I was going to let it be known that I was here, and I was no longer going to be taken advantage of in my life. And so I felt like that was the way to go. I was rebellious against the authority, of course, because I lived lawless. Every single day from the age of 10, 9, to the time I went to prison, I committed a crime every day. Whether it was just stealing or something, it was habitual. Again, it came from a place where my mom and we sold drugs together. My mom, when I was 7 or 8 years old, would open a window to a house and put me through the window and have me open the door so she could break in. So it was natural. And so going into prison, I was conditioned for that environment. I was conditioned for that life. And I wound up getting in a lot of trouble initially. In my first 3 to 4 years, I spent on lockdown in cell blocks on 23 and 1 lockdown, which meant that I spent 23 hours a day in a cell, and I came out 1 hour. And when I came out 1 hour, they let me out of the cell. I had to have on shackles and handcuffs. And they let me walk up and down in the cage. And then when I was done with that hour, they put me back in the cage. When it was time for me to take my shower, I had to go to the shower with shackles and handcuffs, get into the shower, they close the cell, stick my hands out there, take the shackles off. I was an animal to them. And it's because I was hurting, I was angry, and I went about it the wrong way. But I'll never forget, there are 2 incidents that really opened my eyes. 1 or 3 or a few. So in particular, in my hardest years in prison, I remember I had gotten some trouble for what, I don't know, I was always in trouble. And I was laying in a cell, and they had my hands cuffed, my shackles on my feet, and then another shackle down to my ankles, and they had me tied like this in the cell where I couldn't stand up. They took my mattress out of the cell, and I had to sleep on a concrete slab. And so I remember I had the toilet paper, using it as a pillow, and the guard came by my cell and he said, "Charles," he said, "look at you." He said, "I'm going home to my family." And he said, "Look at you, you're gonna be in the same position tomorrow when I get back." And of course, I was upset, I was angry, so I cursed him out and told him to get away from my cell. But when he left, I really thought about that, and I said to myself, what are you doing? Like you're at I was at the lowest of my low inside of a low, In those cells, they had a hatch. So they always keep my hatch closed and my tray hatch closed. So I never knew if it was day or night. The only time I knew was by the meals that were served, what time of day it was. And so from that incident, I got tired. And I remember looking in the mirror, and I was crying. I was feeling sorry for myself, and I looked in the mirror, and I said to myself, don't cry now. Don't cry now, because you weren't crying when you were doing what you were doing. And that was a real eye-opening moment for me, because I had to accept accountability. And that was something very, very difficult to do when, for my whole entire life, I had been a victim. And because I had been a victim, I felt no real remorse about victimizing other people. And in that moment of looking in the mirror and looking at myself and calling myself out, a light went off in my head. And in that, I came to the conclusion that I wanted to be the opposite of everything I'd ever been before. And I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't even know. In retrospect, I had no idea what I was going to have to go through to basically brainwash myself. But it started with a book, actually. And it started with a book called The Road Less Traveled by Dr. Scott M. Peck. And in that book, I read that book, and I cannot tell you today specifically what it was, except that he was psychoanalyzing people. And in some part in that book, I found that my condition was already written. It was already statistically written that because I had a father doing life and a mother on drugs, never mind my 6 uncles who were in and out of prison or my 4 aunts who were in and out of jail, I was already destined for prison or the grave, an early grave. And in reading that, I said, wow, to myself, I said, I fell in the trap. I fell in the systematic trap. And so I began to seek knowledge, is what I began to do. Knowledge, and I began to seek spirituality, faith, God. And at the time, I didn't know what it meant. But I had also, there were other prisoners around me who had been through already what I was going through, and they were well along in their 20 years into their sentences. And so they would see me and they would say, hey, man, read this book. You know, hey, get a GED, go to school. There are educational programs here. There's counseling here. There's all of these opportunities here for you. Take advantage of it. Don't just sit here, whether you get out or not, and spend the next 35 years banging your head on the wall. And they fought with me, and they showed me love, unconditional love. I met fathers and brothers and uncles that I never had in life on the street in prison. And that meant something to me, and that motivated me. That's why I know that mentorship is very, very important. And so with that, I started studying for my GED. And eventually, I did a pre-test for it, and I scored the highest in reading and comprehension. At the time, it was like 12.9 plus. I scored 12.9 plus, which was the highest on that particular test that you could score. And I'm like, wow, I can read. Up until I went to prison, I've never read a book. I've never completed a book. I knew phonics. I obviously knew how to read words and put them together and read sentences, but I cannot tell you a single book up until the age of 17 years old, 18 years old that I ever read in my life. In school, they had sessions. I just didn't participate in it. But to score that 12.9 in that reading and comprehension, I comprehended that. You know, a light went off in my head and it said, wait a minute, okay, your math scores are low, but if you can read and comprehend, that means you can study and bring up your other grades. And that's what I started doing. I started studying, and then it's like I developed a thirst for knowledge, and I lived through books. And I mean, in my time there, I read hundreds of books because that was my refuge. And so after I got my GED, another mentor came to me and he said, hey, why don't you be a tutor? You can tutor the other guys like you were tutored by the other prisoners, because the prisoners in there were the actual tutors. You had a civilian principal and the tutors were inmates. And so I said, hey, not bad, you know. I get to get out of the field. In the field, we'd have to work in the elements, you know, and it was kind of cold in Louisiana at times, kind of like New Mexico weather. So we'd have to go and pick potatoes and corn and hay, you name it. We picked it. And so I said, well, why not become a tutor? It was a prestigious job in the prison system. And so, and you got 20 cents an hour. So, you know, so I took that on, and it was the first time in my life that I ever did something that I can remember to help somebody else. And I'll never, even in this moment, a light went off in my head that up until that point, I cannot think of something I've done to genuinely help someone else that felt good for me. But when I became a tutor, and I tutored phonics, I tutored non-readers, you know, and so I had to teach phonics. I had to teach the lowest level of guys who could not read, and to see them get that light that I got when I scored that grade or when I passed that test, and you see something, that spark go off in their eyes when they finally get it, it did something for me, and it gave me a fulfillment within myself that, hey, I have a 35-year sentence, but my life is still meaningful. And that meant a lot to me, because there's something about when a judge hands you, or he handed me, a 35-year sentence. That to me meant that my life was worthless and that I had no use for society for the next 35 years. I hadn't even been alive 20 years at the time, let alone 35 years. And so after he gave me that sentence, I laughed at him. I said, ha, 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 I'll get out. That was my pride. That was arrogance, because I didn't want him to know that he had broke my soul. When I went back to that cell, it was a gloomy day like today. I cried until there were no more tears, you know. But so being a tutor and getting involved in education and starting to do more positive things in prison started to fill that void of emptiness and give me a deeper sense of value and purpose for life. And so again, that same guy came to me again and he said, hey, you know that they have college courses here? I said, really? College courses in prison? It's like, yeah, man, it's associates in business and humanities. I didn't even know what humanities was. So I was like, sign me up. Because I had developed this mentality of, if it looked good, I was going to gravitate toward. Remember, I'm on a path to do the opposite of everything I'd ever done wrong before. And so anything that was good, that was prestigious, that was beneficial to my spirit, to my soul, that's what I went after. Anything negative, violence, fighting, drugs, all of those things in there, I circumnavigated myself around that, because I'd done that for as long as I can remember, and I knew that that got me here with 35 years, and here, actually. So I went to college, and I would study college at night, and I tutor in the daytime. And I took Toastmasters. FYI, my biggest fear in life was public speaking. I would be at the podium, and I'd tremble, literally, my body, because I was afraid of not being understood, because a part of criminality is antisocial behavior. So you don't deal in the formal social setting. You deal amongst that element, your peers, that criminal element, so you can speak that language, but the fear of having to deal with a civilized society and feeling unworthy or feeling less, it intimidated me. And in truth, you will find that most people incarcerated are extremely insecure, you know, and so it's oftentimes a front of toughness, of aggression that comes out first to hide that insecurity. And that's something that I dealt with within myself, but I pushed through, and every week I'd go to Toastmasters, and I'd get up there and I'd tremble and I'd do horrible every time, you know, but I had put myself in a community of people who were inmates who were seeking something better out of their lives. The majority of them were twice my age, old enough to be my dad. But when I made it to the penitentiary, I was 20 years old. So, you know, most of the people there, they were hard in their life, 2 lives, 6 life sentences, 100, 200, 300 years. Those are the people that I was around because of my sentence and because of my behavior in prison as well. I earned what they call the end of the road. It's where people go to die in prison. After that, it's just a grave. And so, but there, ironically, is where I found some of the most compassionate, loving people on earth, because they had found redemption. And redemption it's a very, very, very real thing, you know, and I cannot stress that enough. And so at that program, I studied, and then another opportunity came for me to go to another prison, and I realized that I was an opportunistic person, because if I saw something better, I went for it. You know, I was telling the guys at the state penitentiary yesterday, I said, a person who commits a crime is a coward, but he's also bold. And that boldness, that's a part of that personality. If you learn how to channel that energy toward something positive and productive, you'll be surprised at the results that you get when you learn to channel energy. And that's something I was learning to do through my faith in God, that, you know, I could do this. So I went to another program. It was a bachelor's program this time, a bachelor's degree of arts in Christian ministry, underlining Christian counseling. I dived into it. I got to the other prison. I started studying. We did 50-page essays, word studies from Greek to Hebrew, back to Latin, to English. We studied world history, business and finance, other religions, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Catholicism. Like, it blew my mind. The love that I have for world history and psychology, I think that if I was born in a different life under a different set of circumstances, then I definitely would have ventured off into maybe the more psychological part of the things in life, because I love people. I love to study people. I love analyzing people. I think people are the most weird, fascinating creatures on earth. You know, we're all different, but we're all the same, you know. And so it was one of the most amazing studies that I think I could have went through, because I got to look at history thousands of years ago and learn that human beings have been broken, confused, lost people since their creation. And since creation, we have tried to find our way toward sanity, you know, toward that peace, toward that center where we line up in our spirits and we feel content in where we're going in life. And what I've realized is that people are we have a deep sense within ourselves to worship something, whatever it is. You ever wonder how people scream at football games or soccer games or church or whatever it is? We have an innate desire to worship. And what we worship matters. What we give that energy to matters. And I say that because I grew up being taught to worship a criminal element. It was a high five and a victory if you got the score. You got the door open, or you broke into the car and you got the wallet. High five, everybody's running and cheering. Like, it was a twisted way of thinking, but something that was fed to myself and many of those other little boys around me by the people we loved and trusted the most. And so in my studies in theology, I guess I felt a sense of normality, because in the Bible I saw a bunch of broken people too who had very similar circumstances in their own time that said that, hey, you know what? You can get it right. And I sat out on that path. And so in 2010, I graduated with a bachelor's degree of arts in Christian ministry, underlining Christian counseling. I got bored, and so I needed something else to do. And so I said, well, I don't really know how to do anything with my hands. So then I said, well, the prison has a mechanic school. They also had a program called prison hospice. So I went to mechanic school during the daytime, and at nighttime I joined the prison hospice. Now, the hospice program in the Louisiana State Penitentiary was iconic because it gave me the ability to learn what empathy was. Because although I was reading those books and getting that knowledge and, you know, doing my spiritual things, I still had to learn another lesson about empathy and having the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And so in the prison hospice, these guys were terminally ill and diagnosed to live 6 months or less. And so these guys, we had to bathe them, we had to feed them, change their diapers, take them outside, listen to them cry, you know, listen to them laugh. We were essentially their everything. We were their arms and legs when they could no longer walk. And finally, when they took their last breath, we were the guys who were called to, clean their bodies and put them in a body bag and bring them to the morgue. And if their families didn't claim their bodies, then we took their bodies and we buried them ourselves. Inmate led, we had a guard there, he just stood there. He was, it was a prestigious program that just not any inmate could get into. You had to meet a certain criteria in order to get into that program. And by the grace of God, I met that criteria, and that's part of the reason I'm standing here today, is because when I finished seminary, I had a friend of mine who was in the hospice program, and it looked good, right? They had their hospice shirts, and the guards respected them, the officers respected them. It could be 3 in the morning, and they can get up and tell the guard, hey, I'm going to the hospital to see my patient, and they're going to open that door, and they're going to let them go. And so I wanted a part of that. Part of it was selfish because I needed the fulfillment. But on the other half of that, I found that you find out who you really are when you're in the trenches. And so when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and that guy needs his diaper changed and you know it and you smell it and it's just you and him in that room, there's been times I'd go in there and certain guys weren't doing it. So, and I'll never forget, and I think that somehow or another God saw this, I don't know. But I believe this in my soul. There's nights I sat there and I was like, I don't feel like doing this. I've worked all day, I'm tired, it's 3 in the morning, and it's volunteer, so that means you sit your shift and you still have to get up in the morning and go to work. And I never forget praying on those nights, God, give me the strength to do this, because if it was me in that situation or someone I loved, I would want for them to be able to do the same thing for me and give me that compassion. And so deep down inside of myself, I dug in and found that there's a person in me that I had no idea existed because I never had an opportunity to really exhibit that. And so the beauty with the hospice program was that when I went for orientation, I signed up and they didn't call me until a year later. And so on the year later, I go there and there's a camera crew there and they hand me a release form, and on the form I see the Oprah Winfrey Network. And there was about maybe 25 other guys with me, and half of them were saying, I'm not signing that, they're gonna make us look bad. So I never forget, I said, well, we can't look much worse than we already look. So I said, where do I sign? And so I signed on the dotted lines, and I left it to God. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. I'm just going to do my best. And I did, and the program aired, and I started getting letters from people all over the world. Bags, like they had a bag just for me and the other guys who were in the documentary, like, this is your mailbag. And that experience was life-changing alone because I got exposed to people. First of all, in prison, because I was looking for good and something different, I always positioned myself to be around a civilized society. So if it meant me getting a job in the prison newspaper because, quote unquote, free people are there more, or in hospice, you're around nurses, you're around doctors, you're around the wardens, you're around other people beside inmates. And I gravitated toward that because I knew that I needed to be fed by that, more than I needed to be fed by the guys in the dormitory. And so I created that element because somehow in my brain, I just felt like that is what needed to be done to continue this process of brainwashing myself. And so I did that, and it worked out. And so getting these letters from people all over the world and seeing their perceptions and perspective on life and information, and then, of course, the love of just all of the books that they would send me. I had the best library, my library was better than the prison library. And so I was able to read books and pass them around to the other guys and start a book club, and we'd read the books. And I only read, I didn't read nonfiction. I felt like it was a waste of brain space, so I only, read real books about real life and real things. And I created a group of guys who would read the same books, and then we'd have dialogue about it, and we'd walk the yard or work out and talk about these things, and we were like philosophers, right? Because we transformed prison into a college. You know, we did our best to mentally block out what it really was, and we created a world of our own. And so through that documentary, a lady out of Miami, Florida, wrote me a letter, and she said, I can't help you, I don't have money, but I think I know somebody who probably can help you. And at this time, I had probably been in prison maybe 12 years or so. And so I'm like, okay, cool, I'll give him a call. I gave him a call, and we talked a few minutes, and he said, yeah, consider me your guardian angel. And I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, you know, like you know, coming from where I come from, those things, you know, they fall to the ground. And not long after that, a week or two later, they called and said, hey, you have an attorney visit. It's like, oh, really? So I go to the attorney visit, and he says, hey, we were hired by Paul Averill, and we're here to represent you and, you know, do what we can to get you out of here. Up until that point in my prison sentence, I had became a lawyer too. And so I took some law classes, and I learned to write motions, and I would harass my judge maybe twice, 3 times a year with motions. A lot of them he denied as frivolous. But I continue over the years to write him motions and even letters. And each time, even when I wrote letters to him, he would interpret my letter as a motion. And he would say that this motion has been denied. But, you know, I'd be discouraged a little bit, and then you know, a couple of weeks later, I go back in the law library and I dig and do research. And so these lawyers are coming to see me, and so I go in there with all of the motions I've ever filed in my 12 years at that time, and I hand it to them. They read over it, and they're like, wow, this is pretty good work. You know, they said, what, you didn't leave a lot of room for us to really appeal your case because you've used all of your avenues, and so now you're procedurally barred. After a certain time frame, you can no longer file motions unless you can find some form of new evidence. And so that's important because those lawyers we wound up letting go, you know, for various reasons. But maybe 4 lawyers later, a lobbyist, and meeting with the governor, and $200,000 later, we find these amazing lawyers who, again, I take these papers to, and they take it, or she takes it, and she says, wow, this is great. She takes the motion, she puts her name on it, changes the heading on the motion, corrects my grammar, and files the same motion I've been filing for, at that point, 16 and a half years. And so we file the motion, and they grant the motion. And the motion is basically that, first of all, I was a juvenile offender when I was arrested. And there was a big deal in the United States during that time about juvenile offenders who were not convicted of murder being sentenced to life without parole or practical life sentences. And in my case, I had 35 years for armed robbery with a BB gun that my co-defendant possessed, not me. But it didn't matter in that instance. I had a 35-year sentence. 3 of my co-defendants, the oldest one was 19. He had gotten 5 years probation. The other 2 got 2 years in juvenile detention centers, and I received 35-year sentence because from the age of 13 to 17, I had maybe 14 or 15 juvenile arrests. The majority of them were for violent offenses. Those violent offenses, at my sentencing, the judge didn't know were against my mother's boyfriend, because when he would beat my mom, I would do everything I could to beat him because that's what I knew. I was trying to protect my mom and my sisters, but what he would do was call the police on me. And I would go to jail, and then my mom would say, don't say anything, because if you do, it's going to make me look bad. And so I take the hit and go to the juvenile and then go to the foster care. And the way it appeared is that, you know, the foster care system knew our family so well because just a quick little historical moment. At the age of 5, I was pushed out of a third floor window by my cousin, and I fell 40 feet and broke both of my arms, my collarbone, all sorts of damage. And we got introduced to the foster care system because of that. And from that point on, they had been constantly involved in our lives. So the foster care system kept a detailed record of everything that was going on. At my sentencing, though, my lawyer didn't have that record to present to the judge as mitigating circumstances. So with this new law coming for juveniles being sentenced to life without parole or practical life, what they did was they said, okay, juveniles who committed murder could get parole after 25 years. Well, that left me up here. What about the juvenile with 35 years or 50 years? Some of them had 99 years for crimes other than murder that were serving more time than people who committed murder. And somehow or another, through reading all these books in the grace of God, I identified that gap. And I was the first person in the United States to get out of prison on that clause and open a door for other people under those same sets of circumstances. So for that, in July 9, 2018, I was released from prison after 17 years. And it was sudden. It was within maybe a 6-week time frame. We hired the attorneys. They went straight at it. They went to speak to the victim, who said, you know what? This man has done enough time. He's done enough. I respect what he's done since he's been in there. I forgive him. She said, have him write me a letter. And I want to read the letter, and then I'll speak to the district attorney and the judge as well to advocate for his freedom. The other part of that is the judge who sentenced me retired, and his son took his bench. And his son reversed the sentence of his dad, saying, you know what, Dad, I think you made a mistake on this one. And all of the old evidence that was used as aggravating circumstances was turned around and used for mitigating circumstances and helped toward my release. That's pretty much in a nutshell. I'm going to do a little photo slide just to show a few pictures of life after. That's me at work right there. I got a trade. Can you hold that picture, please? So while in prison, right at the end of about 2 years before I got out, I said, well, I'm bored again. So what can I do now? And I always hoped that I would get out and live in Florida because I love the palm trees and the beaches, and it seemed, like the thing to do. So the prison I was in had air conditioning, welding, horticulture, a bunch of things. So I said, I want to take air conditioning since I want to live in Florida because it makes sense. So I took up this air conditioning trade and happened to get out of prison 18 years sooner than I was supposed to, or so, whatever the math is. The double digits, I got out sooner. And I got out to a very fortunate situation, and this is relevant because I too want to speak about this situation in New Mexico. That friend of mine, Paul, who assisted in me getting out of prison, also when I got out, made sure I had my license within 4 days, which is very important. On my 5th day, I had a car. My 6th day, my first day, I had a place to stay, first of all. I stayed in a hotel on the beach for 4 months. It was great. It was amazing. I had my license, a car, which gave me the ability to get around, but then I had also a trade in air conditioning. So when my fantasy was over of what real life was, living on the beach, and it was time to go to work, I had a real life skill that I could actually use to get out and get a job and work with. And it's been great. I've been fairly successful at it. I've transitioned from mechanical hands-on side. Now I'm in a sales role, so now I do commercial and residential air conditioning sales. Yeah, so that's that. That's me here last year. But I'm opening the floor for questions. If you guys have any questions you want to write down or ask, Michaela will pick them up with our volunteers back there. And she'll actually read the questions, and then I'll answer them. That's my niece and my daughter back there. A lot that I do for therapy is I hang out with family. I hang out with the younger ones and just really try to invest in their lives. Hi, Michaela. That's my mom right there, actually. A thing about my mom is, so when I went to prison, I had a son that was 6 months old, and my mom took custody of him because his mom couldn't take care of him. And my mom did something that was a miracle. She completely flipped her life around. She started going to church. My son, for her, was another chance at life. And in that, she raised him till he was 17 years old. And eventually I got out of prison, and when I got out, my mom flew down a month later. We spent time together. She stayed here a month. She went back to Boston, and she said, "I'll be back." And she died like a week later. Yeah, so it's like she held on for all of those years. That's my legal team. That's the attorney far to the left. The lady in the black, I guess, would be to your right. With the green, she's the lady who wrote me a letter saying I know a guy, and that guy is the guy in the blue shirt in the middle, Paul. Molly is the lady with the black sunglasses, is the executive producer of the documentary called Servant Life. The two ladies in the orange and white, Samantha and Dominique, are two people who saw the documentary that lived in Virginia and would drive from Virginia to New Orleans or to Louisiana to visit me at least once or twice a month to just whatever I needed, whatever like the attorney needed or my kids needed, like they would run around the United States if they had to make sure that my needs were met. And the other guy there is Sam. He's a friend of Paul's who's now a friend of mine and also one of my mentors. This is all
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you also for being here. First question, Charles. I'm a law student and I want to end mass incarceration. Where are good lawyers needed most?
Louisiana and Oklahoma have the highest incarceration rates in the United States, so if you want to start somewhere, you probably could start in one of those two states. But I think that the problem is more at the top with legislation and the people and coming up with meaningful laws that make a difference in mass incarceration, because guess what? Some people need to be incarcerated. I needed to be incarcerated, and what I believe and what I advocate for is incentive-based sentencing, meaning give him a 35-year sentence. If he did a violent crime or he did something or she did something horrible, give them a sentence that represents that crime. But instead of, like in my situation, saying you have 35 years, you have to do 35 years and then come and see us, I believe that we should have checks and balances within that system or within that sentence to monitor the behavior of that individual in order to determine if they are worthy of release. And in a lot of instances, you don't have that, or it's a mocked system where your destiny is predetermined. So even though you have parole eligibility on your sentence, you will not be granted parole on your sentence, maybe because it's a political crime or for political reasons or because the board doesn't like certain things about your crime. But the thing about it is that the crime itself will never, ever, ever change. The only thing that can potentially change is the human being who committed that crime and the laws that we put forth to allow them that review. The other thing about mass incarceration is that it's the epidemic of mental health and drug abuse. Most people have mental health issues and they use drug abuse to self-medicate. I see that here. Yesterday at the state penitentiary, maybe we had 15, 18 guys in there. We created a circle and I what's your story? What's your story? What's your story? 98% have the practically identical story as me even, but except they were addicted to drugs. I wasn't addicted to drugs. I was angry, which is a different form, of psychological issues. But the majority of them had that very same issue. You look around New Mexico, you see a tremendous amount of homeless people, just broken people that will eventually wind up in the prison, and then they get out, and then they go back, and then they get out. Yesterday we met, of those 18 to 20 guys, another 85, 90% of them have been back to prison 3-4 times. So there is, with mass incarceration, there is a very complex issue that needs to tie in social work, mental health, medical, and corrections. But I think that a more humanistic approach needs to be brought to the situation of mass incarceration, if that makes any sense.
Just a couple comments. I think that's an issue for our state legislature. Maybe you could talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And just a plug for New Mexico, our rate of incarceration is 713 per 100,000, and the rate of the United States is 573. So if you're going to be a lawyer, please stay here. We need you. And this is Charles' second home, so he'll be able to work with you as well. Just quickly, I wanted to invite you on behalf of Pastor Sue. Tomorrow, Charles will be speaking again at service. So you're all very welcome. 10:30 tomorrow morning, he'll be giving the sermon. The next question, did you ever go back to the guard who encouraged you to change and tell him how he impacted you? Or maybe anybody that you worked with during that time?
No, I don't remember. Can I say something really quick? This picture right here is what happens when I got bored in prison. I just went crazy on education, like certificates and what have you. But the question about that particular guard, I think I transferred from that prison. I don't remember. But what did wind up happening is, because when you're in the system so long, the guards get to know you very well, because you have the tendency to travel around the prisons and what have you. And so what winds up happening is you earn a level of respect from the guards that give you opportunities that other prisoners otherwise wouldn't have. For example, at my re-sentencing hearing, 2 wardens came and spoke on my behalf, saying I would trust this guy to be my neighbor, and I would say that, I can't, he said exactly to the judge, I can't tell you to let him out, but if he were my neighbor, I would feel perfectly safe with him being my neighbor. Those are my 2 sisters right there. And so I think that right there speaks volumes within itself.
All right, thank you. I want to go back to, you were mentioning your experience in the penitentiary yesterday, and then he went to Los Lunas on Thursday. Can you talk more about what you see here in New Mexico and what programs, talk about the good that we have here, what we're doing well, and what we could improve on?
Perfect. So have you ever heard of the pipeline to prison? Okay, so that's a very, very real thing. So we have to start back at the housing, the home situation, right? That these people, the common denominator usually is poverty, extreme poverty, drug addiction, and when you live in poverty, you typically live in certain areas. And when you live in certain areas, you typically have to go to certain types of schools. And when you go to those certain types of schools, you have a tendency to find a certain element there that doesn't exist, for example, for my people back there. That element doesn't exist in their school because they go to private schools. Congratulations, much love to you. But the pipeline in prison says that these kids who are born into these poverty-stricken situations will go to these poverty-stricken schools, and these schools are failing because there's a disconnect, I think, between the teaching method, from my own personal experience, and what these kids are going through at home, because a lot of these teachers live in environments different than the environments that these students, like me, the student I was, you know, these teachers typically live in different areas, so it's difficult to relate to those students in that way, and it's very easy to write them off, you know, and it's very difficult to get them engaged. That teacher has a difficult job. That principal has a difficult job. So when that student falls to the wayside and drops out of school and they have this idle time and they're hanging around their element and they're getting high and they're using drugs and getting exposed to those things, like the young kid, 20 years old yesterday we met. He started going to jail when he was 13. He's a New Mexico citizen. He's been to juvenile detention 4 or 5 times, got out. Now he's 20, serving 4 years. He gets out in 8 months. He sat in there. There's currently, for some reason, they say because of COVID in New Mexico prison systems, the programs have halted. They have stopped. So that's a problem. That's a huge problem for New Mexico, because that guy just sat there for 4 or 5 years and he did nothing. And now he's coming right back here into your neighborhood with nothing. And it is a fact, a statistical fact that we can pull up on Google, because I love Google, that the person who gets incarcerated and gets education and finds some form of spirituality is far less likely to recidivate than that individual who is warehoused there for a number of years and just dumped back into society. So the New Mexico problem is that the programming has stopped. And also, there's another program called pre-release that helps prepare the prisoners for release. Wings of Life, I know you guys are involved in that. Project Echo is another program that's involved in that, that tries to do that, but it has to come from the government. The government has to identify this issue and say, the programs have halted for whatever reason, funding, shortness of staff, or whatever. We have to figure out a way to solve that problem. And my solution, because I don't believe in giving problems without solutions, my solution to that problem is that if it's a matter of resources, money, or staffing, that you train inmates, lifers, long-term inmates to be those teachers, to be those tutors, to be those directors and instructors, and you have one free person, civilian, oversee that inmate or that program and allow him to teach those other guys, but don't just let it die. Don't just let it lay flat, because then the problem is perpetuated and it's even worse. And so that's what I'm seeing in the New Mexico prison system right now is, and you guys have, because it's drug addiction, it's a dangerous problem. Between the drugs, the cartels, the gangs, that combination, you have to combat that with positivity. You have to flush those prisons with programs, with churches, going inside, getting with the governor, the Secretary of Corrections, deputy. We actually met the Deputy Secretary of Corrections, and I also got to tell her this exact same thing that I'm saying to you right now, but she doesn't necessarily make the laws, and it's different when it comes from the people, when the people push for it.
Great, thank you. This is from our Zoom audience. What measures are you taking now to speak specifically to young black men, which is percentage-wise the highest population of incarcerated people? And anything in the southern states, anything in Louisiana and Texas and so on?
I have a job. No, I do New Mexico because New Mexico shows me the most love. They get me here, get me out of work. My job supports what I do here. They're very supportive of it. If we had other opportunities, if it were practical, I would take those opportunities. But for right now, New Mexico has adopted me, and so, I'm one man, and this is where I am currently, and if something else were to come up. But I definitely don't discriminate against any. I understand that blacks make up the majority of the prison population, but I look at it as a issue of all. For every human being that is incarcerated or going through a struggle or in that situation, and for every human being who is willing to be receptive, because just because you're black doesn't mean you're going to be receptive to the message. So my target person is the people who are receptive to the message. That's it.
So Charles is definitely open to traveling other places, but he doesn't have the means to go there himself. So if you have ideas and money for the expenses, and thank you so much for everybody for supporting Charles being here. It's because of you that it's possible. All right, one more question, or a few more. When did you first begin to realize you had faith? And the second part, are you still interested in studying psychology in some way, grad school or in some other way?
I realized I had, when you get in trouble, you start to pray, right? You usually, when everything is going good, you usually don't really, me personally, I usually didn't pray, but then I got in some big trouble, and I needed some big saving, and so it was through that process that, I just started searching for a deeper meaning. There's this book, one of the guys, he was in one of the camps, one of the Jewish camps, and he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, that right there is exactly, what he went through was something completely different, but just that search for meaning is what led me to, spirituality.
Okay, and how about this psychology piece? Are you interested in studying that more, or?
What I realized is that part of the side effects to being in prison is that I have a difficult time sitting still. I was telling Michaela yesterday, I've had maybe 4 or 5 cars I've been out 4.5 years now, and I drive a lot. I bought a 2022 car in January. It had 5 miles on it, and today it has 29,000 miles on it. So that's my safe place. I drive a lot, I think. So to sit down in a classroom and study, I think I'm kind of, no, I wouldn't. I love people. I love being out and about and doing this. I love sales and business. I really love business, in fact. That is my thing. Yeah.
All right, a couple sort of related questions. Are you familiar with the work of Gabor Mate? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Does that sound familiar?
No.
Okay.
What is it?
I don't know. It's The Myth of Normal and In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts are 2 of his books. Put that on your list.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Have you heard about Delancey Street program?
Mm-mm.
And I believe that's a program that helps people returning from incarceration as well.
In New Mexico?
Yes. It would be good to get all the stakeholders together.
Yeah, I think actually speaking on that is one of the notes that I've made is that New Mexico is obviously widespread, but somewhat close-knit because the population isn't so huge, that you guys have a few really, really amazing programs here. One of them being Project Echo, Wings of Life, Blue Cross Blue Shield, which we didn't connect with this year, but last year we did. Here, and I think that if somehow or another, we have legislators here, I believe, somewhere, somehow or another, you guys have an amazing platform and also a desire to solve the problem, or at least to reduce it before it continues to get out of hand. Because I have to tell you, what I saw, it's not going. It's getting worse. You know, it's simply because the programming alone has stopped. That's bad enough. But you have a lot of groups here that if you guys were to in some way or another figure out a way to unite, because these groups are working, you guys are working individually, and you know, and that's useful and definitely in its own right. But if you guys identified your own groups right here, I think that you guys could really do some amazing, amazing things and get some great funding to be able to, you know, deal with the same issue that most of you are working on anyway. There's power in numbers.
All right. A couple final questions, and if you have any more questions, please just hold it up and somebody will bring it forward. But these are the last two I have, and I think they're both related to the approach of the current criminal justice system, which is very much punishment-based instead of restorative-based. And so the first question is, what are your thoughts about the correctional system, the environment in it in which if you're not cruel and if you don't if you're not violent, you don't really fit in? I assume that means among the population, or maybe that's the attitude of the guards, that it's just a very oppressive and violent system and you have to be that way to fit in. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly.
From what I understand about New Mexico is they have levels to their prison system, and I guess they have from like level 1 to level 6, and the lower levels are the least of the violent prisons. And so what I saw was an extremely relaxed, almost too relaxed environment at the places that we went. And also what I saw was a group of hungry men. They were hungry. They want something different. Out here, forget about it. They're high, they're on drugs, they're drinking, and there is where you get them. That's where you get them. They're sober. They're in their right minds. You know, they're broken at that point. That is when you swoop in and you say, hey, here's what we have for you. You know, and it's not even that you go. It's about giving them something that will fill their soul. You know, while they're in there, because when you get out, forget about it. The hope is that you get them while they're there. You pump whatever you can into their brains, and when they get out, you pray that they use it. That's it. That's what I see. That's what I saw.
And I think what you're talking about is addressing the root causes of their incarceration.
Addressing the root causes of their incarceration, which I couldn't get them to stop talking yesterday. Like it was difficult. I mean, and I expect that because guess what? We all have a story, right? And over here, we probably have people we can really, really talk to. But those guys over there, when you ask them, what was your life like? They're eager, they're dying to tell you the suffering that most of them have had. But you know what? Listen. Because then when you listen, they feel like you care. And when they feel like you care, they'll be more receptive toward what you have to say after you're done listening. You know, but if you go there to talk at them, fruitless. But if you allow them to express themselves and speak and get off of their chest, it was a tough crowd yesterday. You know, they were tough. You know, then you go in there and it's tattoos on the face, missing eyes, missing fingers. You know, like you can tell that they live very rough, tough lives. But the single question, hey, tell me your story. What's your life been like? And those walls just came crumbling down, and now they're laughing and they're human again. You know, and it's at that point that we come in and we say, okay, I'm sorry that you went through that. And that's, you know, I'm sorry that you went through that. I'm sorry that you were a victim before. But consider this, that I asked him yesterday, why do we become the very thing that we hated? Why do we become the abusers that abused us? You know? And that was a real question. And you know what the answer to that question was? When I asked them, why do we become the abusers that abused us? You know what they said? Because that's all that we know. You know what I said? That's not really true. The reason why it's not really true is because we know better. We all knew better. I knew better. I knew what I was doing was wrong, you know, and to them I say, that's not true because we knew better. Now, I can say that to them, you know. You would have to be very crafty, being you know, not having been where they've been to say that, but I can say that because I've been where they've been, you know, and that's the beauty of being this liaison, you know, or bridging this gap, is that I can say things to them that you guys can't, without shutting them down, you know. And the truth of the matter is we did know better, and we could have done better. And you know why? Because all of those books that I read and all of those things that I've studied, I've read books of people who freaking walked 10 miles in the dirt with no shoes on with books to go to school and became doctors and never went to prison. You didn't have to. Or people who were raped or saw horrible, horrible things happen that didn't have to do the things that I did or the guys who were in that situation did. So for me, I can speak to them, and people like me, I can speak to them and say that that's not an excuse, you know? And that's the truth of the matter is it's horrible what you went through, but it's not an excuse to hurt other people.
Just a clarification, that last question about how cruel the prison system can be was about the guards' attitude towards the prisoners. Was that your experience?
I've seen some wicked things, some wicked humans from on the correction side. They're human beings too. Overall, though, my experience has been, you know, you stay out of their way, they stay out of your way. They respected what I was doing and what people like me do, and then they also respect the dark side. They do. They will, you know, some turn a blind eye, some engage it, some say just don't make enough problems. And if you don't make enough problems, do whatever you want. You know, and then there are those that are vindictive and spiteful and will seek you out to, you know, try to ridicule you or whatever. But overall, in my own personal experience, I really didn't have issues with the guards, unless I created them.
All right. This is the last question we have. And I want to ask a couple related questions. So this person asks, what are your thoughts about the sex offender registry? But this is kind of a larger issue. When you are released, even if when you've done your time, but you've got that felony conviction, or you're on a registry, like, what are the effects? What do you think about that? How has that affected you in terms of being a felon and trying to get on with your life?
I got out not on parole or anything, and I thought that not being on parole would make my life easier. But as far as finding a job, it wasn't difficult. The biggest problem that I had was housing, because in Florida there are a lot of HOAs, and those HOAs do background checks. And with housing, they go back for eternity, you know. And so I've been denied housing. I mean, I have to buy a house. I can buy a house right now, but I'm afraid to because of the market. But so I stay with my partner, but the greatest difficulty has been is renting an apartment or getting a house that has a HOA because of the background check. So I'm going to have to find a house somewhere where that doesn't exist. What was the other part of that question?
Well, just getting out, like, you're on
the
probation, you're on
registries.
a parole registry, felon, like, how easy is it for you to begin life anew when you're carrying all this baggage
Well,
with you?
it's funny because at the penitentiary yesterday, these guys kind of look for supervision. Did you get that? Like these guys were saying, I'm not going to be on parole. I'm afraid. I don't know what to do. Nobody's going to tell me I have to go to work. Nobody's going to tell me I have to do this or that. And I could not relate to that. You know, that shocked my brain because these guys were looking for supervision, which in another sense is a breeding ground for some form of a program that could get those guys and give them some type of structure, you know, that could simulate that supervision without legally being tied to that supervision, because apparently they need it, which was mind-blowing to me because I never wanted to be supervised, and I felt true freedom in that. But it's almost like they were afraid of having the freedom to do what they wanted to do because they don't trust themselves with what they will do is ultimately what it is. I forgot the question though.
No, that was it.
Okay.
Yeah, you did great.
Oh, but the sex offender registry thing. That's a different element in itself. I think that is a mental health situation too that definitely needs supervision, just like drug addiction or any other addiction, because I think that comes from a different place that I definitely, in my experience, I've been around people and I know of experiences, even, I've had patients on their deathbed that were still mentally not good. So with that, I know that's mental health that needs to be supervised aggressively, in my opinion. Yeah.
All right. I think that was our final question. Before we go, first of all, I just want to thank you all so much again for supporting our efforts towards criminal justice reform here in New Mexico. I want to thank Pastor Sue and the UCC for bringing us here, for bringing Charles back, because it wouldn't have happened without her. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the whole UCC community has been so supportive, so thank you. And I also want to just draw your attention, Wings for Life International, they have a table out in the lobby. They do amazing work. If you're looking for organizations to support that are doing this work, Wings for Life is definitely there. Echo New Mexico is doing incredible work with peer education inside the facilities. They're the ones who enabled Charles and I to even get into the facilities and to be part of that. And we look forward to that partnership continuing. UNM Law School is doing incredible work as well. And of course, our state representatives, our faith leaders, our other community leaders are doing great things. And I just want to acknowledge a bunch of students in the back from St. Pius who are doing their best to learn about the issue, even though they're pretty much forced. But they came here on their own tonight, so no extra credit or anything. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. We're right on time. It's 5:30, so
Perfect.
be safe driving, and thank you.
Thank you.